Welcome to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our original theme music is composed by Christopher Mark Colucci. Join us as we cover the continuing story of our Season 3, Philadelphia, the Tryout Town. Covered the boom years of the 1920s in Philadelphia theater, and in our last episode, we heard Bradford Rope's fictionalized account of a typical Broadway musical out-of-town opening night in Philadelphia. That was set in the late 1920s, which was fitting because 1927 was the absolute peak in commercial theater production in the United States. There were 264 Broadway plays, musicals, and revues produced in New York's 70 legitimate theatrical houses that year, a high water mark that has never been surpassed. A majority of these shows had either come through Philadelphia on their way to Broadway or were repackaged and remounted for touring shows after their Broadway runs were complete and came back again to the Quaker City. 1927 is also significant, of course, because that was the year that Al Jolson, one of the biggest stars of the musical theater world, appeared in the first motion picture with Vitaphone sound, The Jazz Singer, the sentimental story of the Jewish cantor's son who makes it big as a blackface soloist in a Broadway musical. The Jazz Singer, of course, had originally been a Broadway show itself, and in April of 1927, a touring company of the Jazz Singer starring Georgie Jessel was just finishing its run at the Broad Street Theater in Philadelphia. In November of 1927, the Jazz Singer was back in Philly, but this time in Jolson's movie version for a 10-week smash hit run at the Fox Locust Theater, a newly built house at the base of the new 22-story office tower that had risen directly across the street to the north of the venerable old Academy of Music. Originally intended as a legitimate house, the Locust was converted instead immediately into one of the first movie theaters in the city. One of the first, that is, ready to host movies with sound. Now, keep your eye on that Locust Street Theater because it's going to come back up again and again in our coming episodes. February 28th, 1929, the Mastbaum Theater, the most luxurious and expensive theater building ever constructed in Philadelphia, had its grand opening. Billed as a playhouse, it was fully equipped to handle both major motion pictures and stage shows. Nothing about the Mastbaum was on a small scale. It had an orchestra pit that could accommodate 100 musicians. Al Jolson himself, in fact, was on hand to be the master of ceremonies of a concert and stage show that lasted all that afternoon. And the new Warner Brothers Vitaphone sound motion picture, Sonny Boy, was then shown. The Philadelphia Inquirer released a special Mastbaum edition for the occasion. The combined movie and stage show palace had been constructed by the Stanley Corporation at 20th and Market Street as a memorial to its late founder, Jules Mastbaum. Mastbaum, a Philadelphia department store magnate who had turned to the movie business, had suddenly died the year before, at the age of only 58. Following Mastbaum's death, the Stanley Corporation had pulled out of their investment in the former Hammerstein Opera House on North Broad, which it had attempted to turn into a movie palace. But now they seemed to want to replicate much of the design and amenities of that North Broad Theater project, except this time in a more central location. The Mastbaum was going to be along the stretch of city blocks where the enormous Chinese Wall, a railway embankment that had led to the old Broad Street station next to City Hall, had recently been cleared away. The Mastbaum Theater was a massive investment. It cost $5 million. Designed by Hoffman Heenan, the 4,738-seat Mammoth Theater resembled in its exterior a Greek temple with street frontage on all four sides. There was a complete secondary theater and a rehearsal hall on the upper level of the building. There were 25 dressing rooms for the company. A huge illuminated sign rose from the roof. It was visible for miles around, broadcasting its presence to the entire Delaware Valley. The audience areas of the Mastbaum were even more lavish, even surpassing those of the nearby Erlanger Theater, which had been built only 2 years earlier down the street. Like the Erlanger, the interior of the Mastbaum's auditorium offered promenades, lobbies, and lounges, all decorated with oil paintings, rare tapestries, marble statuary, and gilt furniture. The auditorium was bedecked with glittering chandeliers and glowing murals. And for additional entertainment, if the stage and movie shows weren't enough, there was a 27-rank Wurlitzer organ whose console could be raised and lowered into the basement. The management had hired a huge staff of ushers, musicians, projectionists, and stagehands, and they were on hand to cater to every need of both performers and audiences. And although the Mastbaum was fairly successful at first, its location on West Market Street, well, it proved awkward to access for most people. But most of all, it was the timing of its construction. And, that was just terrible, as it turned out. Because we're about to reach the infamous October of 1929, which was the crash. October 29th, Black Tuesday, the day the music stopped, and the Wall Street stock market bubble popped. It marked the end of the Roaring Twenties all over the nation, and soon the entire world. But in truth, Philadelphia, the third largest city in America, had already been sounding a warning. It was a bellwether of the trouble to come, if anyone had cared to pay attention. Philadelphia had never truly recovered from the economic shocks of the First World War, and it was already not doing extremely well economically. Local industry, especially the textile manufacturers, had been shedding jobs as mills moved to the non-unionized southern states. In the fall of 1929, the city's unemployment rate was already at 10%. Local theaters were just starting to feel the fall-off in their business. Audiences in Philadelphia were looking for entertainment at the movies instead of live theater, because movies had ticket prices that were much cheaper. The Erlanger Theater, which had just opened as a pre-Broadway tryout house in 1927, was to host Earl Carroll's extravaganza operetta Fioretta in early 1928, bankrolled entirely by the fabulously wealthy and extraordinarily foolish Philadelphia millionairess Mrs. Anne Waitman Penfield. But that show was on its way to becoming one of the most famous and expensive flops ever when it reached New York. And there weren't many other similarly spendthrift financial backers willing to take her place. By the fall of 1929, the Erlanger had also just been converted to become yet another movie theater. This was all part of a wider trend. By this point, almost every Philadelphia vaudeville theater had already been converted to showing mostly films. Even the mighty flagship Keith Theater on Chestnut Street was soon to follow. And all along Market Street, the theaters were now showing only movies, sometimes interspersed with the occasional concert or live acts. Only the big theaters that the Shuberts owned or controls, the Broad, the Forest, the Adelphi, the Lyric, the Chestnut Street Opera House, and of course the Shubert, were still booking shows. The Garrick and the Walnut, the only two independent houses, were having trouble finding tenants. The Garrick was hosting a college musical for the University of Pennsylvania's Mask and Wig Club in October of 1929. The Walnut was hosting a creaky old Victorian melodrama. Theater was not as healthy as it could have been. But on the whole, when the crash came, everybody just kept on doing what they had been doing already. The theater world just didn't suddenly come to a screeching halt. In fact, in episode 50, we already noted how the ancient Greek comedy Lysistrata was successfully staged at the Walnut in the spring of 1930 without even interference from censors, and that it went on to have a nice run in New York afterwards. For nobody realized right away how much worse things would get in America and in American theater. When the banks started failing, as they began to do that summer and fall and the following winter, people began to get the idea that this was going to be really bad. And then, of course, there was the Philly theater that blew up. This is an interesting story and not very well known in Philadelphia even today. On January 9th, 1930, the Globe Theater exploded and, brought down the house. 1 man was killed and 8 others were seriously wounded, and an uncounted number of people were injured by flying glass that rained down upon the streets east of Philadelphia City Hall. Now, the theater was already coming down, a theme which we'll return to again later in the episode. The demolition of this formerly popular vaudeville venue at the corner of Market and Juniper Streets was already underway, admittedly, at the time of the explosion. The Globe had been closed in October of 1929, not because of the stock market, but because it was slated to be replaced by a new 20-story skyscraper. What remained of the theater in January of 1930 was mostly the steel framing, in fact, which needed to be cut apart and dismantled. Now, according to the newspaper reports the following day, the accident was caused by an appalling carelessness during the demolition process. A workman cutting steel beams with an oxyacetylene torch was perched over a 50-gallon drum of gasoline, and sparks from the torch rained down all around it. Now, this drum, amazingly, was in close proximity to both the acetylene and the oxygen tanks. When the sparks ignited a small puddle of spilled gasoline, both the drum and then the nearby containers exploded in a massive blast. The worker who was holding the torch, above all this, was killed, horribly burned, and a policeman monitoring traffic quite close to the site was struck on the head by flying debris. A Philadelphia fireman responding to the blast also later died of injuries. Hundreds of passers-by were struck by flying glass or brickwork. Ignorance or carelessness or both were responsible for the death, injury, and damage to property, scolded the Philadelphia Inquirer's editors the next day. It seems a miracle that scores were not killed and hundreds injured. It was an ominous way to begin the new decade of the 1930s. What really strikes me now about the commercial shows coming through Philadelphia in this interim period after the stock market crash of October 1929 is how much the theater was living in the shadow of the movie business. It's a well-known story, of course, but now that there was sound, movies needed actors who could actually, speak. And everyone began moving out to California. Like George Arliss, our old friend from The Green Goddess, who was already making a hit movie of that play that had its world premiere at the Walnut back in 1920. It's amazing how many future Hollywood movie stars, like Sidney Greenstreet, who had been in that production of Lysistrata at the Walnut, made notable, if brief, appearances in Philadelphia right before they made the trek out west. Here are some other stories about stars on the rise. November 18th, 1929, Maggie the Magnificent was not a hit. By the time the new play of Philadelphia's own Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright George S. Kelly arrived for a post-Broadway stint at the Walnut Street Theater, that much was clear. New York reviews of Maggie the Magnificent had been tepid. Most agreed that the show's star, Shirley Ward, had been fine in the title role, but as they left the theater, everybody was talking about the secondary leads. The actors playing the role of the tough guy brother, a guy named James Cagney, and a pert actress named Joan Blondell. Wrote the Inquirer, the dialogue, particularly in the last act, fairly sparkles. Joan Blondell as Etta and James Cagney as Elwood, a wisecracking young couple, kept the house in constant roar during their final scene in the last act. Maggie the Magnificent actually ended its run after playing Philly. The tour never went anywhere else. And Cagney and Blondell were cast together again in another show called Penny Arcade. Now, New York critics panned Penny Arcade, too, but again, they always praised Cagney and Blondell. And the star Al Jolson, here he comes again, he liked the show, and he bought the film rights. And then he sold that play to Warner Brothers with the stipulation that they cast Cagney and Blondell in the film version, retitled Sinner's Holiday. The movie would again attract good notices for both Cagney and Blondell and serve to give both actors their start in their Hollywood careers. December 8th, 1929, Blind Window opened at the Broad Street Theater in Philadelphia. Blind Window was a prison drama, originally written in Hungarian by the young playwright Elmer Boros, and it had been adapted into English and staged by the theater impresario David Belasco, who is now in his 6th decade in show business. The star was Beth Merrill, who had worked with Belasco previously on the plays Lady of the Evening, Lily Sue, and Hidden. Blind Window had first opened its tryouts in Boston and then Baltimore, and was now in Philadelphia with hopes of heading to a Broadway run. Now, looking at the reviews, it's unclear to me exactly what the play was all about. The Camden Courier-Journal, in its review, wrote, quote, "The story of the play deals with the meeting of a man and woman under the most terrible of circumstances. All the refining influences of civilization are gone, and in their place is but the primal urge of the beast. Then love comes, illuminating the blind window and bringing happiness at the moment when even the tiny comfort of undirected existence is about to be lost." So, clearly not a drawing room comedy. Though his name was not featured in the publicity material, Clark Gable, of course, is the name that stands out to our eyes today in that cast list. Gable had already made a name for himself in the play Machinelle by Sophie Treadwell on Broadway the previous year, but he was by no means yet a star, nor had he affected his famous mustache. He's still clean-shaven in the publicity photographs for the show. In late 1929, Gable was still trying to extricate himself from his first marriage to his wife and acting coach, Josephine Dillon, 17 years his senior. Gable took the job with Belasco's touring company while waiting for the divorce from Dillon to become final so that he could marry his current girlfriend, the Texas socialite Rhea Langham. Now, Blind Window, unfortunately, was not a success for David Belasco, and it closed without ever reaching Broadway. Clark Gable then joined the touring company of another prison drama entitled The Last Mile, and when it played Los Angeles, he was quickly snapped up by Hollywood. The next time he played Philadelphia, Clark Gable was not live on stage. His face was on the silver screen in the 1931 movie The Finger Points at the Stanley Theater on East Market Street. September 8th, 1930. The actor Donald Meek was in Philadelphia, starring in a touring production of his recent Broadway hit comedy Broken Dishes by Donald Flavin. Meek was playing Cyrus Bumstead, described by a local reviewer as, quote, "a long-suffering husband who cringes before his wife for years, but who finally rebels when he finds his love for his daughter a stronger influence than fear of his wife. The most hilarious moment in the play comes when Bumstead gives his consent to the girl's marriage and the young couple are wedded by a deaf old clergyman while the mother is off at the movies." The engagement at the Adelphi Theater was a bit of a homecoming for Meek, a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in Philadelphia as a boy and gotten his start in the theater on the city stages 40 years earlier. Donald Meek, of course, would go on to have his own successful Hollywood career as a reliable character man, appearing in such films as Stagecoach, State Fair, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and You Can't Take It With You. But although he was, in 1930, a well-known Broadway character actor, Meek's arrival in town was not what excited the Philadelphia press. They were much more interested in the prospects of the 19-year-old actress playing his daughter, a young lady from Boston named Betty Davis. Betty Davis had already appeared on a Philadelphia stage. Only the year before, she had appeared with a distinguished company of actors led by Blanche Yurka, who brought 2 Henrik Ibsen dramas to the Walnut Street Theater. Every character was drawn with vivid reality, enthused one Philadelphia reviewer, but special honors must go to Betty Davis for the starkly tragic power of her enactment as the child Hedwig, who is the real wild duck. The Actors Theatre may be complimented for bringing forward such an actress, wrote the Camden Courier-Journal. A potentially splendid actress had the good fortune to get with a repertory company where real work is accomplished. I'm a lucky girl, says Miss Betty Davis in an interview. You're great and will go far, the reporter replied, a little gushingly, perhaps, but with some admirable powers of prediction. December 29th, 1930, Girl Crazy, the new musical by George and Ira Gershwin, premiered at the Shubert Theatre on Broad Street in Philadelphia, beginning a 2-week pre-Broadway tryout run. With a thinly plotted book by Guy Bolton and John McGowan, Girl Crazy was typical for musicals of the period. A New Yorker takes over a remote dude ranch in Nevada and imports an entire Broadway chorus to liven things up. Nevertheless, he ends up falling in love with the local postmistress. Hilarity ensues, and happiness prevails, and there are lots of excuses for singing and dancing. What distinguished Girl Crazy were all the great songs in the score, of course, including Biding My Time and But Not For Me. There were also more forgettable songs like Cactus Time in Arizona and Land of the Gay Caballero. For many nights of the run, George Gershwin himself conducted the orchestra at the Shubert. Also in the score was the Gershwin tune, But Not For Me, and there to sing it was Ginger Rogers. Ginger Rogers was only 19 years old and had been working the Orpheum circuit in the vaudeville world since she was 14. Rogers had already appeared in Philadelphia the previous December in her first real musical called Top Speed, and on her return back to Philly, she told the newspapers that she was glad to be back again because Philly had been lucky for her the last time. A guy named, let me check my notes here, Fred Astaire showed up at one point to help choreographer George Hale with Ginger Rogers' dance numbers, along with her then co-star Alan Kearns. It was likely at some rehearsal for this show in Philadelphia, as he demonstrated a particular move, that Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers danced together for the first time. And I should mention the other star of the show, Ethel Merman, who was 22, already a big deal in the nightclub and vaudeville stage, and in fact had already appeared with Ginger Rogers in an early pre-code movie called Follow the Leader. But Girl Crazy was going to be Merman's big Broadway debut. She was playing a character called Frisco Kate, and she not only got to sing Gershwin's songs Sam and Delilah and Boy, What Love Has Done For Me, but she also got to show off her amazing vocal power by belting out I Got Rhythm and holding a single note for so long and at such volume that every night it brought down the house. The play gets a snap and a bang from the start, raved the reviewer in the Enquirer. The applause for one number is still ringing when the next one is on its way. With tuneful music, with splendid dancing, and a beautiful, hard-working chorus and exquisite settings, it is not surprising that Girl Crazy should have such an instant and emphatic hit. That was a correct prediction, because after its Philly tryout engagement at the Shubert, the show went straight to the Alvin Theatre in New York, where it had 272 more performances. Ginger Rogers left for Hollywood at the conclusion of the run, where soon she was being featured in our old friend 42nd Street, as well as in some movies with, that guy, Fred. Now, there are other bold-faced names I could talk about that came through Philadelphia in that year or so after the crash. For example, in January 1931, a young actor named Cesar Romero was in town at the Broad Street Theatre in a play called Strictly Dishonorable. But what I'd really like to talk about is one of my favorite Philly origin stories, the Nicholas brothers. Fayard and Harold Nicholas were born in the South to two musicians, Viola and Ulysses Nicholas, along with their sister, Dorothy. The Nicholas family moved to Philadelphia in 1926 to an apartment building directly across from the Standard Theater on the 1100 block of South Street. There, the parents became fixtures in the theater's house orchestra, which went by the name Nicholas's Collegians. The Standard Theater, which you may remember if you went way back in our earlier podcast, was built in 1892. And it was then at the height of its success in the local black community, featuring bills of premier African-American vaudeville acts. Fired Nicholas, the oldest son, would spend hours in the theater every day and was fascinated by the skills of such dance acts that came through town, like the Whitman sisters, John W. Bubbles, and Bill Robinson, that he saw on the Standard stage. He seems to have been tutored by a local tap dance teacher named Charlie White, by the way. Fiard then taught everything he knew to his younger siblings. He first performed as a duo with his sister Dorothy, and then both of them were joined by little tiny Harold. In 1930, the trio, the Nicholas Kids, made their debut at the Standard. Now, a dynamo on the stage, Harold idolized his older brother and learned to dance by copying his moves. The Nicholas trademark move, this jump that would fall down the stage and then end in a deep split, was lifted from a dancer named Jack Wiggins, who had also come through the Standard. Eventually, Sister Dorothy opted out of the family act. She wanted to read books more, she said. And the Nicholas Kids became instead the Nicholas Brothers. Now, there was quite a size difference between the two brothers at first. Fiard was quite tall, and Harold was kind of short. But there was no discernible difference in their dancing talent, and that was really part of the charm of their amazing act. And as their fame spread in Philadelphia's clubs along South Street, the duo was first hired by a local radio show, the Horn and Hardart Kitty Hour. And by 1932, the two boys were doing film shorts for Warner Brothers, like the one whose soundtrack we're listening to now, Pie Pie Blackbird. Soon they were performing in New York's Cotton Club, and then in Hollywood movies, and in Broadway shows, and on London's West End. And by 1940, well, the family all moved to Los Angeles together. The Standard Theater, however, fell on hard times during the Depression. In 1931, it was sold when its owner, the African-American banker John T. Gibson, went bust. Just like the other historically black theater nearby, the Lincoln Theater, the new management of the Standard converted it into a movie house. 2 decades later, both the Lincoln and the Standard would be torn down. February 16th, 1933. It was the absolute depth of the Great Depression in America as the nation waited impatiently for the final weeks of Herbert Hoover's failed presidency to expire and that of the new guy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, to begin. Economics were very bad in Philadelphia showbiz as well. Local civic-minded organizations like the Theater Guild or the Professional Players had done what they could, bring in plays that would interest the local crowd. And the local stock theater company star, Mae Desmond, had taken over the Locust Theater, now converted back from a movie house into being a legit stage, until she too was forced to give up. The Garrick, the Schubert, the Chestnut Street Opera House, and the Walnut Street Theater were all dark. The Arch Street Theater was offering a little Yiddish drama, but at much reduced prices. In late February of 1933, only one major theatrical production was running in all of Philadelphia. The Forest Theater on Walnut Street, alone in the city, had a lit marquee, advertising tickets for sale. And maybe, just maybe, it seemed like happy days were here again. The show just arriving at the Forest was Of Thee I Sing, again, the George and Ira Gershwin musical, a satire of American presidential politics. It featured the Gershwin songs Love is Sweeping the Country, Who Cares, and a reworking of I Got Rhythm. It had already run for 55 straight weeks in New York. There were pointed political songs in the peppy show as well, including Wintergreen for President, The Senatorial Roll Call, and We'll Impeach Him. The book of the show about the candidate John P. Wintergreen, who runs on the Love platform, and who finds love along the way, of course, was by the team of George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskind, who had already won the 1932 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Gershwin and his creative team might have been a bit leery of doing a satirical show in Philadelphia, since, as we mentioned in episode 68, their 1927 musical Strike Up the Band had closed there after a brief run to the Schubert. But in 1933, well, there was literally no competition for their satirical musical, And this was one of the very few Broadway shows to do a national tour that entire season. Indeed, work was so scarce for Broadway actors that the entire original cast stayed with the show when it came to the farce, which was very rare. Seen in the show were William Gaxton as John P. Wintergreen, Lois Moran as his love interest and the eventual First Lady, Mary Turner, and Victor Moore as Vice President Alexander Throttlebottom. Now, I'm not going to go through every show that came through Philadelphia in the mid-1930s. For the most part, they were few and far between. Certainly much less than in boom times. Inevitably, Philadelphia theaters began to be torn down. Theaters were being knocked down as useless old buildings, relics whose moments had passed. And most of all, they were being knocked down to make parking lots. Now, at the beginning of the decade, in 1930, 80% of all intercity traffic in and out of Philadelphia had been by rail. But despite the ongoing economic depression, as the decade of the 1930s went on, it was automobiles that increasingly became the preferred method of transportation for people coming in and out of the city. And, therefore, there was demand for places to put the cars. No single economic factor was going to change the physical landscape of Philadelphia more. In 1935, the massive castle-like casino theater, which for many years had been a burlesque house, 2 doors down from the Walnut Street Theater, was demolished to make room for a surface parking lot, a purpose for which it is dedicated to this day, almost 9 full decades later. Then, in June 1936, the Arch Street Theater, the oldest intact Victorian theater in the city, was torn down. And although, of course, I never personally knew this theater, from all the years I've spent researching it and talking about it, this one really hurts. I got to admit, Mrs. John Drew's Arch Street Theater had been the home of her famous stock company. Almost every member of the Drew family had performed there, and the little Barrymore children, Lionel, Ethel, and John, had sat in its seats and watched their family perform. And as the 20th century began, the surrounding neighborhood had deteriorated. As we've mentioned several times, the old theater now stood in what was called the Tenderloin, very close to Skid Row. But nonetheless, it had still been the vibrant home to many great Yiddish theater companies, and had seen performances by both Boris Tomaszewski and the great Jacob Adler. In its very last years, it had also hosted vaudeville shows, and then finally, low burlesque. By 1936, the theater was now disused and vacant, and the developers quickly sprung. Nobody made much of a fuss that I can see. That summer of 1936, the city's newspapers were full of stories about the Republican and Democratic national conventions, who were both in Philadelphia that year. The Democrats, of course, renominated FDR, and the Republicans put up Alf Landon of Kansas to oppose him. I can't remember how that one turned out. Joe Louis and Max Schmeling were about to stage a big fight. Schmeling won that one. The St. Louis Cardinals were in town to play the Phillies. The Phillies mostly lost. And that was dominating the news. The loss of an old theater, well, not a big deal. In the Philadelphia Inquirer, I can find a small notice in one of the back pages posted by the Integrity Wrecking Company, listing all the equipment and materials for sale, including theater seats, fire extinguishers, fans, chandeliers, drop curtain, asbestos curtain, plushes, velours, fire hose, etc. But as far as the demolition of the historic old theater, the Inquirer sent no reporters to cover the story. They were all over at the convention center. The Philadelphia Evening Bulletin and the Public Ledger at least dispatched photographers who snapped some photos and documented for the last time the details of the theater's lobby, its dressing rooms, and the beautiful dome ceiling over the audience. The Ledger's Henry Murdoch, a reporter who was assigned to write a single summation of the theater's history, at least thought to walk over there before they tore it down and poke around the soon-to-be-demolished old building. Murdoch discovered that up to the very last minute before its demolition, its stage was being used by painters and scene craftsmen to make scenery for other local theaters. But even as these workers continued this final act of creative work in the old Art Street Theater, other men labored to dismantle it around them. It was a hard job, because it wasn't like the Art Street Theater was falling down. It was a sturdy, beautiful old building. And as he walked out of the old stage door, wrote Murdoch, the theater's old watchman, with glum emphasis, remarked, "This old place could outlast a damn theater I could mention, but I won't." What theater that night watchman had in mind isn't clear. Murdoch doesn't say. Maybe he meant the nearby Trocadero or the Bijou, burlesque houses that had seen better days by that point. But those somewhat scandalous places weren't on anybody's list to be destroyed. Not yet, anyway. Nor was, thankfully, the old Walnut Street Theater, though it came very close. Only its rental by the WPA Theater Project saved it at all. Or, also the Walnut wasn't just on an attractive notch piece of real estate to tear down and park cars or build another new store. And other great old Philly theaters weren't so fortunate. In January 1937, the Garrick Theater went down. Mrs. Ann Waitman Walker Penfield, the daughter of William Waitman and the backer of the failed Fioretta, had owned the theater since her father's death in 1904 as part of her extensive real estate holdings in the city of Philadelphia. But Mrs. Penfield had passed away in 1932 with most of her money intact, and the Penfield estate was now selling off the property to raise more funds. The site would become a Woolworth store. During its demolition, however, a time capsule which had been placed in the Garrick's cornerstone in 1900 when it was built was uncovered. And photographs that I found in both the Evening Bulletin archives and that of the Inquirer documented the opening of this time capsule. Officiating the little event was Townsend B. Young, a trustee for the Penfield estate, and Louise Strawbridge, a niece of Mrs. Penfield. Also present was William C. Campbell, a superintendent of the estate, who recalled, in fact, being present when the theater was built and that time capsule was first hidden away. In the strongbox of the time capsule, when it was opened, were newspapers from December 20th, 1900. A gold illuminated parchment signed by theater manager Frank Howe was discovered in excellent condition. But missing from the box was something they expected to find, a bottle of Jamaica rum, which, by press accounts from the 1900 newspapers, had been carefully placed there as a good luck token. Well, so no rum. This was a disappointment. Everyone had expected to open up the bottle and have a memorial taste of the lost old Garrick. There was no explanation for its absence. I guess somebody pocketed the bottle before burying the time capsule. So they were sorry about losing that bottle, but there was precious little sentimentality about the loss of the Garrick. Reported the Inquirer. 3 large photos which had adorned the Garrick's lobby had been saved, as had photos of George M. Cohan, Maude Adams, Fred Stone, Cleo Mayfield, and other stars of bygone days of theater. They will be given to anyone asking for them, wrote the paper, but it's not clear that anyone ever did. The Schubert brothers, our old friends from episode 67, they were also consolidating their real estate holdings. The Schuberts had barely emerged from a financial crisis in 1932, and Lee Schubert had ended up buying himself personally all the outstanding stock of the Schubert Company. And to raise a little more cash, he decided to sell off some of his real estate assets in various cities, including Philadelphia. He kept the Schubert in the Forest, but other theaters could go. And this included the Broad Street Theater, which had stood since the Centennial Exposition of 1876. Broad Street came down August 1837. The month after that, the twin theaters, the Lyric and the Adelphi, north of City Hall, were sold and leveled. The Chestnut Street Opera House, another relic of the 1870s, would soon follow. Some of its space, at least, was taken up by a new building, the Mercantile Library, but where the auditorium of the theater had been, and some of the old library, just to the north of that new library, Well, no, not a parking lot, no. It became a different new blight on the landscape, an above-ground, 3-story parking garage. Though it's definitely showing its age, that parking garage is still there. I parked there myself just the other day. I'm not really the hero of the story. I guess I'm part of the problem too. Just like everybody else, people want to drive and they want to park their cars when they get there. In March of 1937, as compared to October of 1927, the commercial theater situation in Philadelphia had been drastically altered. There were literally no live plays being performed on major commercial stages anywhere in Philadelphia. All the melodramas, musical, and variety acts had gone to Hollywood. There were movies available everywhere in Philadelphia, delighting audiences with the spectacles and narratives that had once been the sole province of live theater. It's just that now the drama and the actors that people had enjoyed in person were now on the screen. Some people noticed. Drama Deserters was the headline of the Callboys Chat, the weekly column about the stage in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Quote, "Until almost the 0 hour, drama diehards of this district had hoped, wistfully and wanly, that some hitherto unheralded hero of the theater would suddenly step forward to save the city from the sad situation of a week without a single stage show at this time of year. Nothing of the sort has happened, however, for our quondam heroes and heroines of footlight fame are now almost all out in Hollywood, feasting on the fat of films." To the callboy, it seemed that only the wealthy and influential were still enjoying the fun of live shows. Harvard's Hasty Pudding Club was coming to the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on Broad Street in April, noted the newspaper with its musical review entitled "Come Across." However, if the callboy had just bothered to look elsewhere on the same page of his own newspaper, he would have seen where the real heroes were. They were in small amateur theater groups at the YWHA and the Theater League, where in basement halls and auditoriums, the next generation of Philadelphia theater people were hard at work, and theater practice was being shaped. There were 9 small local theater groups sponsoring a contest for new plays. And out in Rose Valley, Jasper Dieter's Hedgerow Theater, with its collectivist repertory spirit, was still offering a full slate of classic fare, a double bill of The Dark Lady of the Sonnets by George Bernard Shaw, as well as his Androcles and the Lion, and an uncut version of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. A play called One Way to Heaven was scheduled for Saturday night at the Hedgerow. In March of 1937, for Philadelphia area theaters, there was literally no way to go but up. That's our show. If you've been enjoying this season of the podcast or have any thoughts or suggestions at all, drop us an email at aithpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We always reply right away. To support the show and to get access to bonus material and special insider info about Philly theater history, our Patreon page is patreon.com/AITH podcast. Or another way to thank us, and again, I cannot repeat this enough, is to leave some stars and a review about this show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It'll just take you a few minutes. Please go and do it now. You can do it right on our website at www.aithpodcast.com. A review helps us out so much, and that's what you're going to do as soon as I stop speaking, right? Right? Yes, 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 you are. You are amazing. Thank you. This is Peter Schmitz, the chief cook and bottle washer, as well as being the resident know-it-all smarty pants in chief. The sound editing and engineering for this episode was all done by my humble self, here at our studios in our world headquarters, high atop the Tower of Theater History. Thank you for listening and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.